The maid signed a greeting to the billionaire's deaf mother. Instead, her hands exposed a fraud, a $10 billion conspiracy hidden in plain sight. Now every power in the room wants one thing. From the maid who speaks the billionaire's mother's forbidden language. The glass walls of the penthouse stretched 40 stories above Manhattan, turning the skyline into a second glittering ocean. Iva Lopez balanced a tray of champagne flutes as a string quartet played something expensive and forgettable, the kind of music that existed only to fill the silence between deal-making and polite lies. At 22, she had learned to move through rooms like this without being seen. Eyes down, steps quiet, hands steady even when her heart wasn't. "Canapés to the gallery corner," murmured another server as they passed. "And don't linger near the art. Mr. Rodriguez gets twitchy when staff get too curious." Iva nodded, weaving between clusters of donors in gowns that cost more than her yearly rent. She'd been working this event circuit for 8 months now, serving people who never looked at her long enough to remember her face. That invisibility was supposed to be a refuge. Tonight it would become something else entirely. Before we continue, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story makes you believe that no secret is hidden forever. Now, let's get back to the story. Across the room, Eleanor Ramirez sat in a velvet chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silver hair catching the low light like brushed metal. She was 67, elegant in burgundy silk, and completely alone despite being surrounded by 100 people. Her right hand lifted, a tentative half gesture, the beginning of a question. But the interpreter standing 3 feet away had already turned to chat with a trustee about vacation homes in Aspen. Iva's chest tightened. She knew that look. The moment when someone decides their voice doesn't matter enough to repeat themselves. She shouldn't interfere. The tray in her hands was her job, her paycheck, the thing that kept her little apartment heated and her student loans from defaulting. But her feet carried her forward anyway, past the donor circles and the art installations, until she stood close enough to catch Eleanor's eye. Iva set the tray on a side table and signed, her hands precise and warm. "Good evening. Do you need anything?" Eleanor's face transformed. Not just surprise, relief, the kind that comes from being seen after months of being looked through. Her hands moved quickly, fluidly, forming sentences that carried weight and specificity. "The custodian is wrong. The city is wrong. Something about the last transfer never smelled right." Iva's pulse kicked up. She signed back. "What do you mean, wrong?" Before Eleanor could respond, the interpreter materialized at Iva's elbow, voice smooth and dismissive. "She says she's fine. Just enjoying the evening." Iva turned, met the interpreter's eyes, and signed exactly what Eleanor had said. Custodian, city, transfer, the unease threaded through every gesture. Then she spoke aloud, her voice steady despite the adrenaline sparking through her veins. "That's not what she said." The string quartet faltered for half a measure. Conversations dimmed. Across the room, Rodriguez Ramirez, tall, sharp-suited, radiating the kind of control that came from building empires before breakfast, stopped mid-sentence with an investor and turned. Eleanor signed again, her hands moving with sudden authority, as if a dam had finally cracked. "The green portfolios. The numbers they show me don't match what I approved. And she gestured sharply at the interpreter, keeps telling people I agree when I don't." Iva translated, word for word, while the room held its breath. Rodriguez crossed the polished floor in 4 long strides, his steel-gray eyes locked on his mother's face, then on Iva's hands. "Repeat that," he said quietly. Slowly. Iva did. Every sign. Every nuance. The way Eleanor's eyebrows shifted to turn a number into a command. The deliberate pauses that separated dates from amounts. The interpreter tried to cut in. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is highly irregular." But Eleanor raised one hand, palm out, and signed a single sharp phrase that needed no translation for its force. stop speaking for me. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, of assumptions collapsing, of a woman who had been flattened into furniture suddenly reclaiming every inch of space she'd been denied. Rodriguez's jaw tightened. He looked at Iva, really looked the way people do when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew. "What's your name?" "Iva Lopez, sir." "And where did you learn to sign like that?" Iva's throat went dry. This was the moment where invisibility ended, where her carefully constructed small life opened into something she couldn't control. She could feel the tray behind her, the exit 20 feet away, the safety of not matching. But Eleanor was watching her with eyes that said please. "I learned ASL in a church outreach program when I was 15, Iva said, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "I worked with deaf elders for years. Tutored kids. It's not just vocabulary. It's listening to what people actually mean, not what's convenient to hear." Rodriguez's expression shifted, not softening, but sharpening into focus. He glanced at the interpreter, whose face had gone carefully blank, then back to his mother, whose hands were already forming new sentences, new revelations, as if a decade of silence had been waiting for this single opening. "Tomorrow morning," Rodriguez said, his voice cutting through the resumed murmur of the crowd. "You're coming to the gallery preview with the board. I want you there when my mother speaks." The interpreter stiffened. "Mr. Rodriguez, I really must protest." "You're dismissed," Rodriguez said, not looking away from Iva. "Effective immediately." Iva's hands were shaking now, but not from fear. From the weight of what she'd just set in motion. The locked doors suddenly flung open, the truths that had been waiting in the shadows for someone to finally speak their language. Eleanor reached out and gently touched Iva's wrist, then signed something that made Iva's eyes burn. "Thank you for hearing me." Rodriguez watched the exchange, something unreadable flickering across his face, and Iva understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't just about correcting a translation. This was about a son realizing how long his mother had been speaking into a void, and a family's empire built on a foundation of carefully managed misunderstandings. The quartet resumed playing. Guests returned to their champagne and their deal-making. But in the corner by the windows, 3 people stood in a pocket of transformed air. A maid who had stopped being invisible, a mother who had reclaimed her voice, and a billionaire beginning to understand the cost of not listening. What Iva didn't yet know was that Eleanor's precise memory held the keys to everything. Vault accounts, escrow codes, passphrase embedded in handshapes that the old interpreter had always smoothed into meaningless pleasantries. She didn't know that tomorrow's gallery preview would crack open a conspiracy worth billions, or that the dormant portfolios Eleanor kept mentioning were a trail leading straight to systematic fraud. But as she met Eleanor's eyes and saw a decade of suppressed authority burning there like banked coals finally given air, Iva understood one thing with perfect clarity. The most dangerous people in any room are the ones everyone has stopped listening to. And tonight, the listening had begun. But as she met Eleanor's eyes and saw a decade of suppressed authority burning there like banked coals finally given air, Iva understood one thing with perfect clarity. The most dangerous people in any room are the ones everyone has stopped listening to. And tonight, the listening had begun. Morning light filtered through the gallery skylights, turning the white marble floors into sheets of pale gold. Iva arrived at 8 sharp, her hands still tingling from last night's adrenaline, and found Rodriguez already there, standing in front of a Rothko with his phone pressed to his ear and his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. He ended the call when he saw her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. Not anger, but the kind of focus that came before controlled demolition. "My mother will be here in 10 minutes, he said without preamble. "The board arrives at 9. I need you to translate everything she says, exactly as she says it, no matter who objects." "Understood," Iva said and meant it. Eleanor arrived with a nurse who clearly had no idea what was about to happen. settling into a chair at the head of the long glass table that bisected the gallery like a spine. She wore navy blue today, her silver hair pulled back, and when she saw Iva, her hands moved in greeting. "Good morning. Are you ready?" "I'm ready," Iva signed back, and Eleanor's small smile carried the weight of a shared conspiracy. The board filed in at 9, 7 trustees in expensive suits, the family office lieutenant with his leather portfolio, 2 auditors who looked like they hadn't slept, and trailing behind them all, the replacement interpreter Rodriguez had hired overnight. The new interpreter was younger, cautious, and positioned herself where Eleanor could see her clearly. But Eleanor's gaze stayed fixed on Iva. "Let's begin," Rodriguez said, taking his seat across from his mother. "We're here to review the quarterly liquidity authorizations and confirm the instructions regarding the green portfolios." The replacement interpreter started to position herself closer to Eleanor, but the older woman raised one hand and signed directly to Iva. "I'll work with her." The interpreter blinked, recalibrated, and stepped back. One of the trustees, a man named Garrett with silver temples and a Rolex that caught the light, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ramirez, we just need to confirm that you're comfortable deferring the audit timeline to next quarter, given the market volatility." The interpreter turned to Eleanor, signing a simplified version, but before she could finish, Eleanor's hands were already moving. Sharp, deliberate, loaded with specificity. Iva watched the sequence unfold, a name signed with precise finger spelling, then a month expressed with cardinal direction and eyebrow grammar that turned it from March into that March, followed by a city signed with local idiom, and finally, 6 two-digit pairs articulated with holds and emphasis that made them commands, not suggestions. The interpreter hesitated, then offered, "She'll defer to the committee." Iva's heart kicked. That wasn't even close. "No," Iva said quietly, stepping forward. "That's not what she signed." Every head turned. Garrett's expression flattened into irritation, but Rodriguez leaned forward, eyes locked on Iva. "Then what did she say?" Iva took a breath and rendered the full sequence aloud, matching Eleanor's cadence. "Custodian Gerald Fentress, March of 2 years ago, branch in Philadelphia," and the numbers 14-03-22-88-45-17. "She's not deferring, she's telling you where to look." The room went still. Eleanor nodded once, firmly, and signed again. "Audit Retrieval Protocol. My husband and I set it up. They know what those numbers mean." "Audit Retrieval Protocol," Iva repeated, and her voice didn't shake even though her pulse was hammering in her throat. Rodriguez's jaw worked for a moment, then he stood. "We're pausing this meeting. Get Gerald Fentress on the phone. Now." Speaker mode. The family office lieutenant shifted in his seat, his face carefully neutral. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is highly irregular. We have procedures. And my mother just invoked one." Rodriguez cut him off, his tone blade sharp. "So get him on the line or I will." One of the auditors moved fast, pulling out a tablet and dialing. The line rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Fentress here." "Mr. Fentress, this is Rodriguez Ramirez. I'm here with my mother, Eleanor, and she's asking about a retrieval protocol. March, 2 years ago, Philadelphia branch, reference numbers 14-03-22-88-45-17. Does that mean anything to you?" There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling, and then Fentress's voice came back, slower and weighted with recognition. "Yes, sir. That's a dormant audit flag tied to Mrs. Ramirez's original trust instructions. She and your father set up rotating custodians with dual signature confirmation requirements. Those numbers unlock a secured access log for transactions that bypassed the rotation protocols." Rodriguez's eyes cut to his mother, whose expression remained calm and unmoved, as if she'd been expecting this all along. "Pull that log," he said into the phone. "Send it to my auditors within the hour. And Mr. Fentress, Thank you. The call ended. The silence that followed was different from last night's stunned hush. This one had teeth. Garrett recovered first, his voice tight. Eleanor, this is a misunderstanding. The liquidity orders were approved through standard proxies. Eleanor's hands snapped into motion, and Iva translated before the replacement interpreter could even start. I never approved those proxies. Someone has been signing for me, and I want the original trust rules pulled from the archives. Now. One of the auditors spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. We've been reviewing the transaction notes flagged in last quarter's compliance sweep. Multiple liquidity orders were processed through a related party vehicle that's structured as an ESG fund. The authorization notes consistently reference interpreter-mediated preferences from Mrs. Ramirez. Interpreter-mediated, Rodriguez repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He looked at the family office lieutenant, whose face had gone pale. Where's Carlson this morning? The lieutenant's throat bobbed. He called in unavailable. Personal emergency. How convenient. Rodriguez turned to the auditors. Flag every transaction tied to that ESG vehicle. I want names, dates, and flowcharts by end of business today. Then he looked at Iva, and his voice shifted into something steadier, almost gentle. From this point forward, your translations are the official record. I want every word my mother signs entered into the minutes, and I want signed video records for all future consents. Iva nodded, her chest tight with the weight of what he'd just handed her. Eleanor signed something then, her hands slow and deliberate, and Iva's voice wavered only slightly as she translated. My husband and I built safeguards because we knew power gets careless about listening. You need to go back to the beginning, to the rules we made together, before anyone else disappears what's left. Rodriguez stood, crossed to his mother's side, and for the first time since Iva had met him, he looked unsure. Then he bent slightly, met Eleanor's eyes, and said, I'm sorry I stopped listening. That ends today. Eleanor touched his hand briefly, then signed to Iva. Thank you for not being afraid. Before Iva could respond, Rodriguez's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression went cold. Legal just sent an email. A power of attorney rider surfaced in an omnibus proxy from 18 months ago. Processed during your recovery from pneumonia, mother. Eleanor's hands moved before he even finished. I was never asked to sign anything. I was in the hospital for 3 days, barely awake, and when I came home, no one mentioned proxies. The room seemed to tilt. Garrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping against marble. This is a witch hunt. This, Rodriguez said quietly, is the truth finally getting air. And if you were involved, Garrett, I suggest you lawyer up. Iva watched Eleanor's face, saw the vindication and exhaustion warring there, and understood that this was only the beginning. The numbers, the custodians, the rotating protocols, they were breadcrumbs leading to something much larger, much darker, and Eleanor had been leaving them for years, waiting for someone who knew how to read them. And now someone finally did. By noon, the boardroom had transformed into something between a war room and a confessional. Counsel had arrived. 2 sharp-eyed attorneys from the firm that had served the family for 30 years, and they'd cleared the space of everyone except Rodriguez, Eleanor, Iva, and the 2 auditors who looked like they'd aged a decade in 3 hours. The glass table was now covered in printouts, tablets glowing with spreadsheets, and a single leather-bound folder that someone had pulled from the archives, its edges soft with age. Eleanor sat at the center of it all, her hands resting on the table, and when the lead counsel, a woman named Diane with steel-gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, asked her to walk them through the original trust structure, Eleanor's face shifted into something Iva had never seen before. Absolute clarity, the kind that came from a mind that had been waiting years to finally be asked the right questions. My husband and I built this together, Eleanor signed, and Iva's voice became her instrument. We knew that power makes people lazy, that distance makes them careless, so we created rules that required effort and attention. Diane leaned forward, pen poised. What were those rules, Mrs. Ramirez? Eleanor's hands moved with the precision of someone reciting a text she'd memorized in her bones. Rotating custodians. No single bank holds everything for more than 18 months. Dual language confirmation. Every major decision requires both spoken record and signed video, archived separately. No omnibus proxies without my explicit video consent. And no consent counts unless the signing includes the mnemonic chain. Mnemonic chain? Rodriguez asked, his voice tight. The authentication system, Eleanor signed, and her slight smile carried an edge of vindication. Names paired with number clusters that mapped to vault accounts, escrow keys, passphrase. Information that only I would know embedded in the way I sign. If someone was actually listening, they'd recognize the pattern. If they were just paraphrasing for convenience, they'd erase it. Iva's pulse kicked as the architecture clicked into place. That's what you were doing last night, she said, forgetting for a moment to translate, speaking directly to Eleanor. The custodian name, the branch city, those 6-digit pairs, they weren't random details, they were the key. Eleanor nodded, and her hands moved again. Every authorization I ever gave included pieces of that chain. But for the last 10 years, the interpreter stripped them out and replaced them with, she agrees or she defers. No one was listening closely enough to notice what was missing. Diane's pen stopped moving. And without those embedded codes, there was no way to verify that the authorizations were genuine. Exactly, Iva said, translating Eleanor's single, firm sign. Rodriguez stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders rigid. For a long moment he just stared out at the skyline, and when he spoke, his voice was raw. I thought the complexity was normal. I thought needing 3 calls to move liquidity was just how family offices worked. Complicated governance, layers of protection. But it wasn't protection, was it? It was camouflage. You trusted the wrong people, Eleanor signed gently, and Iva softened her voice to match. And they relied on you being too busy to question them. One of the auditors, a younger man with circles under his eyes, cleared his throat. We've traced the flow. The so-called temporary liquidity orders, over 60 in the past 8 years, were funneled into a vehicle called Greenhold Partners. It's structured as an ESG investment fund, but the beneficial ownership traces back to a shell company in Delaware that lists the former interpreter, Marcus Carlson, as a director. Art-backed loans, the second auditor added, scrolling through her tablet. Timber concessions in the Pacific Northwest, carbon credit derivatives tied to projects in South America. All of them marked as illiquid to justify selling them at a discount into Greenhold. Except they weren't illiquid. They were just inconvenient to hold if you wanted to extract value quietly. Rodriguez's hands curled into fists. How much? We're still calculating, but preliminary estimates put the discounted transfers at somewhere between $8 and $10 billion over the past decade. The number hung in the air like smoke. Iva felt Eleanor's gaze on her, and when she met the older woman's eyes, Eleanor signed something that made Iva's throat tighten. I tried to tell people. 4 years. But no one was listening in my language. We're listening now, Rodriguez said, turning back to face his mother, and the exhaustion in his voice was edged with something harder, resolve. He looked at Diane. What do we need to do? First, we formalize Ms. Lopez's role, Diane said, nodding at Iva. If she's going to be the official interpreter for all governance interactions, we need a contract, confidentiality agreements, and a clear chain of authority. Eleanor's hands moved before anyone else could speak. I want her as my accessibility liaison. Not just an interpreter, someone who sits at the table, who reviews documents before I'm asked to sign, who makes sure my language is never filtered again. Iva's breath caught. Mrs. Ramirez, I'm not qualified. "You're the only person who's listened to me in a decade," Eleanor signed, her expression fierce. "That makes you more qualified than anyone in this building." Rodriguez met Iva's eyes across the table. "The role is yours if you want it. Council will draft the contract today." Iva wanted to say she needed time to think, that this was too much too fast, but when she looked at Eleanor's face, at the hope and determination burning there, she found herself nodding. "I'll do it." Diane made note, then looked at Rodriguez. "We'll need to file emergency motions to freeze Greenhold's assets and force a full accounting. But you should know this will get ugly. The trustees who facilitated these transfers will fight back, and they'll come after your mother's competence to discredit her testimony." As if summoned by prophecy, Rodriguez's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression went cold. Too late. Garrett just leaked to the Financial Times that the family is misunderstanding complex instruments due to communication challenges. He's spinning the narrative before we can file. Eleanor's hands snapped into motion, and Iva translated the fury in every sign. "Let them try. I remember every transaction, every date, every number they tried to hide from me. My memory isn't scattered, it's evidence." Rodriguez's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so sharp. "Then we give them evidence they can't spin." He looked at Diane. "File the motions. Freeze everything. And make sure every filing includes video records of my mother's testimony, with full transcripts." The room shifted into motion, counsel on phones, auditors pulling files, Rodriguez firing off emails. But Eleanor reached across the table and touched Iva's hand. When Iva met her gaze, Eleanor signed slowly. "I'm sorry you have to carry this weight. You didn't ask for it." Iva thought about her answer for a moment, then signed back. "Listening isn't weight. It's alignment. And I'd rather be aligned with the truth than comfortable with lies." Eleanor's eyes brightened with something that might have been tears, and she squeezed Iva's hand once before turning back to counsel with the posture of someone ready for war. By 5 o'clock, the emergency filings had gone out. Motions to freeze Greenhold Partners, compel asset accounting, and suspend all proxies pending a full governance review. By 5:30, the retaliatory letter arrived, printed on heavy stock with a law firm's letterhead that probably cost more than Iva's monthly rent. Rodriguez read it aloud, his voice flat. "They're challenging mother's competence to testify. They want a court-appointed medical evaluation and a stay on all enforcement actions pending the outcome." Eleanor didn't flinch. She signed one sentence, and Iva's voice carried it into the room with perfect clarity. "Let them examine me. I'll show them exactly how sharp my memory is when someone finally bothers to ask in my language." Rodriguez looked at his mother, really looked, the way he should have been looking for years, and nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." Outside the windows, the sun was setting, painting the skyline in shades of amber and steel, and Iva understood that they just crossed a line from which there was no safe return. The conspiracy had a shape now, a map drawn in Eleanor's memory and verified by numbers that didn't lie, and the people who'd built their fortunes on silence were about to learn that the most dangerous weapon in any war is the truth, spoken clearly, in the language where it actually lives. Rodriguez had faced hostile boardrooms, activist investors, and market crashes that wiped billions off the books in minutes. But standing behind a podium with camera lights burning his retinas and 50 reporters shouting questions felt like stepping into a different kind of war. One where every word could be weaponized and every pause analyzed for weakness. Garrett Hendricks, the ousted trustee, had beaten them to the narrative. His quote was already running on every financial network. The family's $10 billion recovery is aspirational at best, a misunderstanding of complex derivative instruments by people who, with all respect, may not have the technical background to interpret what they're seeing. The implication was clear. The Ramirez family was either naive or desperate, and Eleanor's testimony was unreliable. Rodriguez's jaw ached from clenching it. Beside him, Eleanor sat with her hands folded on the table, serene in a charcoal suit, and Iva stood just behind her left shoulder, positioned so Eleanor could see her clearly without turning. The cameras loved the optics even if they didn't understand them yet. The powerful matriarch, the silent daughter-turned-translator, the billionaire son trying to control a narrative that was already slipping through his fingers. A reporter from Bloomberg raised her hand. "Mr. Ramirez, can you respond to concerns that your mother's health issues may have contributed to confusion about these transactions?" Rodriguez felt his mother's hand tap the table twice, her signal that she wanted to respond. He yielded the microphone and watched as Eleanor's hands began to move. Iva's voice came clear and steady, matching the rhythm of Eleanor's signing. "I don't have health-related confusion. I have a decade of being deliberately mistranslated so that people could authorize transactions I never approved. If you want specifics, I can give them to you." The room shifted, not dramatically, but in the way attention sharpens when something unexpected cuts through rehearsed statements. A reporter from the Financial Times leaned forward. "What kind of specifics?" Eleanor's hands moved faster now, and Iva kept pace, her translation precise and unadorned. "Transaction identifier GH 2047, authorized in March 2 years ago, transferring timber concessions to Greenhold Partners at 42 cents on the dollar. The authorization was attributed to me, but the custodian change, from Fentress, Philadelphia to a secondary holding in Delaware, was never something I signed. The interpreter reported that I preferred to streamline, but what I actually signed was a question. Why are we moving assets to a non-rotating custodian without dual confirmation?" The room went quiet. Someone's phone camera clicked. Eleanor continued, and Iva's voice carried every number, every date, every shift in Eleanor's eyebrow grammar that turned context into command. "Transaction GH 2198, September the following year. Carbon credit derivatives marked a liquid and sold at 38 cents on the dollar to the same fund. I never approved a discount. I signed that the assets should be held until the compliance review cleared them for sale at par." The interpreter told the board I was comfortable with committee discretion. Rodriguez watched the reporters' faces change, watched skepticism harden into focus, and felt something shift in his chest. Pride, maybe, or the relief of finally fighting with the truth instead of around it. A CNBC anchor raised his stylus. "Mrs. Ramirez, how do you remember these details so precisely?" Eleanor's hands slowed, and Iva's voice softened to match. "Because I designed the system with my husband to require precision. Every authorization I gave included embedded authentication. Names, numbers, sequences that only I would know. When those pieces started disappearing from the board minutes, I knew someone was filtering my voice. I just didn't have anyone who would listen in my language until 3 days ago." By the time the press conference ended, the markets had already responded. Volatility that had spiked on Garrett's aspirational comment eased as filings confirmed asset freezes and analysts noted, on air, in real time, the unusual specificity of Eleanor's testimony. "This isn't vague recollection," one analyst said into a Bloomberg camera. "This is forensic-level detail backed by custodial records. If the family can prove these transfers violated fiduciary protocols, the recovery isn't aspirational, it's contractual." But the counterattack came fast. By evening, a demand letter arrived at counsel's office, printed on law firm letterhead thick enough to stop bullets. Rodriguez read it in the hushed conference room with Diane and Iva, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They're alleging that Ms. Lopez coached my mother, that the testimony was artificially precise and represents undue influence over a vulnerable adult." Iva's stomach dropped. "I only translated what she signed." "We know," Diane interrupted, her tone clipped and efficient, "which is why we're releasing the time-stamped signed video records from every governance session since you started interpreting. The timestamps show Eleanor initiating content, pausing to organize her thoughts, then signing complete sequences while you relay. There's no coaching. There's translation. Rodriguez looked at Iva, and something in his expression made her realize how exposed she'd become. "They're going to come after you personally," he said quietly. "Are you prepared for that?" She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. The warning arrived 2 hours later, a text from an unknown number that made Iva's hands go cold. "Careful, Ms. Lopez. Employment visa complications can take years to resolve. Wouldn't want anything to disrupt your status." She showed it to Rodriguez, and his face went flat in a way that reminded her he hadn't built an empire by being soft. "They're threatening your immigration status?" "It's just a warning. It's witness intimidation." He stood, pulled out his phone, and within minutes had his PR team drafting a statement. By midnight, it was posted across every platform. Ms. Iva Lopez serves as the family's accessibility liaison under a formal contract approved by the board and protected by legal privilege. Any attempt to intimidate, harass, or threaten her status will be met with criminal complaints and civil action. Her role is essential. Her translations are accurate, and her integrity is beyond question. Iva read it on her phone in the back of a car Rodriguez had insisted drive her home, and for the first time in 3 days, she let herself cry. Not from fear, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being protected by people with the resources to mean it. The fracture line split open the next morning when IT discovered that someone had tried to delete the family's archived governance files overnight. The attempt failed. There was a mirror backup on an air-gapped server, but the access logs told the story. The family office lieutenant, the same man who'd gone unavailable during the gallery meeting, had logged in at 2 a.m. and targeted every file tagged with Eleanor's consent protocols. "Panic move," Diane said grimly, reviewing the logs. He knew the videos would prove Eleanor was never confused, just ignored. Rodriguez held a second press briefing that afternoon, this one shorter and sharper. He thanked Iva on the record, his voice steady and deliberate. "Ms. Lopez is the professional who restored fiduciary truth to this family's governance. Without her willingness to translate with fidelity instead of convenience, we would never have uncovered the systematic fraud that cost us billions. I'm asking the media, and anyone who interacts with my mother going forward, to address her directly, through sign-friendly questions, so her voice is never filtered again." Eleanor, sitting beside him, signed a single phrase that Iva translated with a slight smile. "It's about time." As the room cleared and the cameras powered down, Diane caught Iva's elbow. "Council is filing the clawback executions tonight. Seizures, injunctions, negotiated settlements with the counterparties who didn't know they were receiving stolen assets. It's going to move fast, and we need you on standby in case Eleanor needs to authorize anything in real time." "Where?" Iva asked. "The penthouse library. Dawn, bring coffee." Iva nodded, exhaustion and adrenaline tangling in her chest, and as she walked out into the cool night air, she understood that the war wasn't over. It was just moving into its final phase, the one where the money came home and the people who'd stolen it ran out of places to hide. The penthouse library smelled like old leather and bergamot tea, and in the thin blue light before sunrise, it felt like the only quiet place left in the world. Iva arrived at 5:30 with 2 cups of coffee she'd picked up from an all-night deli, her hands still cold from the walk, and found Eleanor already there, seated in a wingback chair near the window with a wool blanket across her lap and her eyes on the skyline. Eleanor turned when Iva approached, and her hands moved in greeting. "You're early." "Good. I wanted to tell you something before the lawyers arrive." Iva set down the coffee and settled into the chair across from her, the city sprawling below them like a grid of light and shadow. "I'm listening," she signed back. Eleanor's hands moved slowly, each sign deliberate and weighted with memory. "When my husband and I built the trust, we were young and maybe a little arrogant. We thought we could design something that would outlast us, that would protect our family even after we were gone. But he said something I've never forgotten. He said power gets lazy about listening, and the moment we stop requiring effort and attention, the whole structure will rot from the inside. She paused, her gaze distant, then reached out and tapped Iva's wrist 3 times to punctuate the next clause. So we built rules that required effort. Rotating custodians so no one got comfortable. Dual language confirmation so my voice couldn't be erased. Authentication codes embedded in my signing so precision mattered more than convenience. Iva's throat tightened. And it worked. The system held. It just needed someone to enforce it. It needed someone to listen, Eleanor corrected gently, then glanced toward the door as footsteps approached. Rodriguez entered, still wearing yesterday's shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hair uncombed and his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked at his mother, then at Iva, and managed a faint, rueful smile. Council says we're 30 minutes out from the first confirmations. The counterparties are capitulating. Eleanor's hands moved, and Iva translated. Before the money comes back, I need you to make me a promise. Rodriguez crossed the room and knelt beside his mother's chair, and for the first time since Iva had met him, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a son trying to find his way back to something he'd lost. Anything. Repeat the core covenant in sign, Eleanor's hands said, and Iva's voice carried the weight of the request. Not speech. Sign. So you remember that governance isn't just policy. It's a language, and if you don't speak it, you can't lead it. Rodriguez looked at Iva, and she could see the uncertainty in his face, the fear of failing in front of both of them. But he lifted his hands and began, the signs clumsy and hesitant at first, rotating custodians. Dual confirmation. No proxies without video consent. Eleanor's hands corrected his finger placement on consent, guiding him gently, and he repeated it, his movements steadying as he continued. Precision matters. Listening matters. Power is only legitimate when it's earned through attention, not assumed through convenience. By the time he finished, his hands were no longer shaking, and Eleanor reached up to cup his face briefly before signing. Good. Don't forget. I won't, he said aloud, and the promise in his voice felt like a contract written in bone. At 6 a.m., the dashboards lit up in the adjacent boardroom. Green bars ticking upward as asset freezes converted to negotiated returns, as counterparties who'd unknowingly received discounted transfers agreed to settlements rather than face prolonged litigation. Diane and the auditors watched the numbers climb, their faces tight with focus, and when the final tranche posted at 6:47, the lead auditor looked up and said, "Total confirmed recovery. 10,200 million." The room exhaled as one. Rodriguez stood at the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass, and when he turned back, his expression was carved from something harder than relief. Vindication, maybe, or the grim satisfaction of a war won at cost. What's next? Reform, Diane said, pulling up a document on the screen. The board convenes at 9 to ratify the new governance charter. By 9:30, the votes were in. The board, now missing 3 trustees under investigation and 1 lieutenant already in plea negotiations, ratified a slate of reforms that would reshape how the family's empire functioned. Dual-channel consent requiring both spoken and signed records for every major decision, permanent video archiving with independent third-party access, rotating interpreters selected by Eleanor herself, and an accessibility charter that would extend across every subsidiary, every partnership, every corner of the sprawling enterprise. Eleanor sat at the head of the table for the first time in a decade, and when the votes were counted, she signed a single word that made half the room blink back tears. Finally. Iva's translations were appended to the official minutes, her name listed not as support staff but as accessibility liaison with standing authority to halt any proceeding where Eleanor's voice was being filtered or flattened. Rodriguez announced a restructuring of the family office, invited external oversight from a governance watchdog, and personally signed a memo that would be distributed to every employee. We failed to listen. That failure cost us billions and nearly destroyed the integrity my parents built. It will not happen again. The aftershocks came in waves, emails from donors thanking Eleanor for modeling transparency, notes from employees who'd watched the press conference and felt something shift in how they understood leadership, and a formal request from a coalition of deaf advocacy groups asking Iva to help design training standards for neutral court officers and fiduciary interpreters nationwide. Iva read the request on her phone while standing in the empty boardroom, the city brightening beyond the glass, and felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders. Not crushing, but substantial, the kind of responsibility that changes the shape of a life. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, and her hands moved with a wry humor Iva hadn't seen before. Enough noise. I need breakfast. The room. Diane, Rodriguez, the auditors who'd barely slept in 4 days. Laughed, the sound startling and human, and Iva felt a knot in her chest. Later, as the room cleared and the lawyers packed up their tablets, Iva pulled out a slim notebook she'd been carrying since the gallery meeting. On the first page, she'd sketched Eleanor's mnemonic map. The names, the number clusters, the cadence and emphasis that turned signing into authentication. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to preserve the architecture, to make sure it lived somewhere other than memory. She showed it to Eleanor, who studied it for a long moment, then signed, "Keep it safe. Teach it to people who need to know that power without precision is just noise." Rodriguez approached as Eleanor stood to leave, and he looked at Iva with an expression that was part exhaustion, part calculation, part something softer. The foundation is launching an initiative to standardize accessible fiduciary processes across the industry. Training, certification, model governance structures. We want you to advise. Not just consult, lead. Help us build something that makes what happened here impossible to repeat. Iva's first instinct was to say she wasn't qualified, that she was just a translator who'd stumbled into something larger than herself. But then she looked at Eleanor, who was watching her with quiet expectation, and she understood that qualifications weren't the point. Fidelity was, and she'd already proven she had that. She lifted her hands and signed a single word, clear and deliberate. Yes. Rodriguez smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and extended his hand. Then let's get to work. As the morning light flooded the penthouse and the city woke below them, Iva pocketed the notebook, felt the weight of it against her ribs, and understood that she was no longer invisible. She was the person who'd listened when it mattered, who'd translated truth instead of convenience, and in doing so had helped dismantle a conspiracy and recover a fortune. But more than that, she'd given a woman her voice back, and in a world built on noise and shortcuts, that was the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in billions. It could only be measured in what came next.
Thank you for watching the story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So, do check it out.